Okay, so welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing depression and antidepressant drugs. Okay, right. What we're now going to do is discuss the pathogenesis, or at least what is understood about the pathogenesis of depression. Okay, and we're going to do this for both the depressive periods of major depression and also the depressive periods of bipolar depression. Okay, we're not going to discuss the pathology of the manic periods of bipolar depression because that's just not understood, basically. Okay, right. So the first thing to say is that depression does run in families. Okay, so if your parents have depression, then you're more likely to have depression as well. So it runs in families. Okay. Now, however, it can't be purely down to genes, and the reason is that you can do studies between monozygotic twins. Okay, so you can get two monozygotic twins, and if one of the monozygotic twin... Oh, and I should have just said, monozygotic twins are identical twins. Okay, so these two twins are going to be genetically identical. Now, let's say one of them ends up developing depression. The other twin is not 100% guaranteed to get depression, basically. Okay, so that shows us that it cannot purely be down to genetics, because otherwise you'd expect that if you looked at every monozygotic twin pair around the world, and you looked for examples where one of them had depression, you'd expect the other to always have depression. Okay, but that's not what you see. Okay, so there's a fancy word for that, so people call it the concordance rate in monozygotic twins. Okay, so concordance means that the two have got the same thing, basically, that the two twins have are concordant, are the same. Okay, so the concordance rate between monozygotic twins is less than 100% in the case of depression, which means that you can go around the world and you can find monozygotic twin pairs where one of them has got depression and the other has not. So that shows that it can't be truly down to genes. Okay, there must be environmental and developmental components to the pathology of depression as well. Okay, right. So now to the cause of depression, and I'll just put this aside and get a new piece of paper. Okay, the first thing we are going to talk about is the involvement of the anterior cingulate cortex. Okay, and you might think, hang on, why aren't you presenting the monoamine hypothesis now? The monoamine hypothesis is a beautiful hypothesis for the cause of depression. It's a beautiful theory. Okay, it makes utter sense, and there is lovely pharmacological evidence in favour of it. The problem is that when you actually look in depressed individuals to see whether the monoamine hypothesis seems to be true, then the data starts to get a little bit more fuzzy, okay? So the monoamine hypothesis is gradually starting to lose favour. It's a beautiful hypothesis that explains exactly how antidepressants work, but it is potentially not true, basically. It's potentially not the cause of depression. Okay, something that shows up again and again as the cause of depression, or at least very much so related to depression, is the anterior cingulate cortex, and it's the anterior cingulate cortex that we're going to begin with. Okay, so the anterior cingulate cortex. So before I say anything else about the anterior cingulate cortex, we need to do some neuroanatomy, because I'm not assuming that everyone viewing this video will be familiar with where the anterior cingulate cortex actually is. Okay, now before we go any further, actually I'll just firstly tell you that the anterior cingulate cortex is often abbreviated to the ACC. Okay, right, so let's now do some neuroanatomy. So I'm going to start off with pictures that I hope everyone will be familiar with, and then we'll go to pictures that maybe everyone isn't familiar with, and we'll talk through them nice and slowly. Okay, so the first picture that I hope everyone is familiar with of the brain is that if you were to remove someone's skull and just look at the brain from, let's say, the left-hand side, you would see something that looks like this. Okay, so here is the left cerebral hemisphere that we're seeing here. Okay, here's the temporal lobe. Okay, and then it goes around and up there. Okay, so this is the brain viewed from the left-hand side, basically. Okay, and then poking out from underneath, you'll see the lower parts of the brain stem. So here is the pons, here is the medulla. Okay, so this will be poking out from the bottom of the cerebral hemispheres, and then it will go into the spinal cord down here. Okay, and I'll label up these structures in a moment. And then right at the back, you've then got the cerebellum, the mini brain. Okay, so let's label up the structures here. So this little mini brain here is the cerebellum, and this is extremely important in the control of motor activity. It's extremely important in calibrating fine motor movements. So for instance, if you're catching a ball, okay, that needs to be an extremely calibrated movement so that you actually do catch the ball and don't miss it. Okay, and it's the cerebellum. Oh, that's smudged horribly. It's the cerebellum that's very involved in doing that. Okay, so then underneath here we've got the spinal cord, and obviously the spinal cord will go on for a lot further. Okay, so it will go right down here, along, running through the vertebral canal. Okay, so we'll colour in the spinal cord, and I think I'll go over to colouring in dashes to avoid the smudging. Okay, then the first portion of the brainstem that's just above the spinal cord, and this is sitting right in the midline, so you've only got one of these. You know, you've only got one spinal cord, and then it's just basically the continuation of the spinal cord. So it comes up, and it's going to enter the bottom of the brain right in the middle. Okay, the first component of the brainstem is the medulla. Okay, sometimes fully called the medulla oblongata, but we'll just call it the medulla. So that's there in blue. And then the portion that we can only see a bit of here, and then it becomes the higher portions of this, and the portions of the brainstem above it are in the middle of the cerebral hemispheres now and can't be seen on this picture. Okay, this is the pons. Okay, here in green. Okay, right, and then we've got the left cerebral hemisphere here, or there is another word for that, the left cerebrum. Okay, right, so that's one picture of the brain, and I'm hoping everyone's familiar with that. Whoops. Now, let's look from a different angle. Okay, let's now look from above. Okay, and I'm going to go away from drawing it on the side like this, but instead now I'm going to draw the front at the top and the back at the bottom. Okay, so what I'm going to draw now is something that looks like this. So we are now seeing the top of the cerebral hemispheres from above, and you have two separate cerebral hemispheres. Here is the left cerebral hemisphere, and then sitting here, this will be, whoops, the right cerebral hemisphere. Okay, right, so this is the brain viewed from the above, basically. Okay, this is the front of the brain, so your eyes will be over here. Okay, and this is the back of the brain, so this is the back of your head. Okay, so this is the left cerebral hemisphere, or the left cerebrum. Okay, and this is the right cerebrum here. Okay, now you'll see that there is a great big crack in between the left and the right cerebrum, and it's not quite so obvious as that, but it is quite obvious that there's a great big crease in between the two. Okay, this is known as the great longitudinal fissure, or if you're being less grandiose, you'll just call it the longitudinal fissure. Okay, so the great longitudinal fissure. Okay, right, now in my next picture, the picture I'm going to draw next, what we are going to imagine doing is taking a great carving knife and putting it into the longitudinal fissure and cutting all the way through, okay? And we're going to slice the brain down into two portions. Okay, now when we do that, we will chop all the way through the cerebellum, okay? So the cerebellum has two halves. We will chop right down through the cerebellum, we'll chop the cerebellum in half. The brainstem structures and the spinal cord, those are also sitting perfectly in the midline. So if we keep our knife exactly positioned along the midline, we will chop the brainstem completely in half, and we'll get half on one side and half on the other side. Okay, right. Now what I'm going to do is look at the new open aspect of one of these halves. So I'm going to take one of the halves out now and have a look at this portion that I can't at the moment see, because I would have to go into the longitudinal fissure to see it. Okay, so by chopping in half I can now have a look at what that concealed surface looks like. Okay, so that's what I'm now going to do. Okay, the fancy way of saying this is that I'm going to do a sagittal section. Okay, so a sagittal section in anatomy means that you're taking, you're chopping in this sort of aspect. You're putting the front of your knife at the front of the person, the anterior aspect of the person, and you're putting the back of your knife at the back of the person, and then you're chopping down like that. Okay, and that goes wherever you are in the body. So if you could do it to the arm, you could do it to the heart, etc. Okay, but we're doing it to the brain. Alright, so we're going to take a sagittal section of the brain. So let me now draw what we're going to see. So, firstly, let's start with the cerebrum. Okay, so here we will have the cerebral hemispheres. Okay, and let's say we're looking at the right one. Okay, so we've chosen to pick this bit off, and we're now looking at this aspect that we couldn't see before. Okay, right. So here is the right cerebral hemisphere here, going round like so, and then it will end somewhere down here. Okay, let's now put the portion of the brainstem that we've got in here, but before that actually I'll just put in the temporal lobe here, so that's the temporal lobe. Okay, then we'll have the pons here. Okay, so this is the pons. And we'll have this coming up a little bit further. We'll have the pons here. Okay, so this is half of the pons. We've cut through the pons here, and we're seeing the right half of the pons now. Okay, then we've got the medulla below the pons again. We're seeing the right half of the medulla, and then we've got the right half of the spinal cord here. Okay, then we've got the right portion of the cerebellum here, so I'll put that there. Okay, and now we're going to see the structures above the pons. So we'll see the top of the pons now, because we've cut through. We couldn't see this previously, but now that we've cut down the middle, we're going to be able to see the bits that are buried deep within the cerebral hemispheres. Okay, and above the pons, what you then have is the midbrain. Okay, above the midbrain you then have the right thalamus. Okay, now I should say you have one medulla, one pons, one midbrain, but then you have two thalami which are sitting on either side of the midbrain. Okay, so the midbrain sits in the midline, but then perched on the right hand side you have a right thalamus, and perched on the left hand side you have the left thalamus. Okay, so you have two thalami. Since we're looking at the right portion of the brain, this is going to have to be the right thalamus here. Okay, now both of the thalami are in the shapes of eggs, and if you don't fully understand that at the moment, we will come back to this later on. Okay, later on we're going to need the nucleus accumbens. Okay, and to show where the nucleus accumbens is, I'm going to discuss the thalamus in a lot more detail. Okay, so this is the right thalamus here at the moment. I'll colour things in to keep it nice and simple. So here is the pons, at least the right half of the pons. We've got rid of the left half of the pons. Okay, in green here. Here is the medulla, here in blue. Okay, here is the spinal cord, again down here in red. Okay, here is the cerebellum, here in orange. Okay, and now we've got the midbrain. What colour should I colour in the midbrain? You've got one midbrain. We've got the right half of the midbrain here in purple. And now you've got two thalami. We're seeing the right thalamus here in turquoise. Right, okay, the other thing I want to put on here is the hypothalamus. So you'll have the hypothalamus sort of sitting here. Here's the optic chiasm. Here will be the pituitary stalk sort of going down, and we'll put the pituitary gland in to some extent there. Okay, so here's the hypothalamus here. I'll colour that in as well. So in yellow, this is the hypothalamus, and again we'll discuss the anatomy of the hypothalamus in more detail. The hypothalamus and the pituitary gland is there. Okay, these are actually going to become very important in our next discussion of something about depression. So at the moment we're discussing the anterior cingulate cortex, but we're about to turn our attention to the HPA axis, which is going to very much so involve the hypothalamus. So we will come back to this as well. Okay, so this is the hypothalamus, and this down here This is the pituitary gland, and you've got the anterior portion and the posterior portion of the pituitary gland there. Okay, so that's the pituitary gland. Okay, right. Now, I'm going to put in the corpus callosum. Okay, now what is the corpus callosum? Well, the corpus callosum is a huge network of the axons of neurons, basically, and it is a connection that exists between the two cerebral hemispheres. So if I was to go down into the the longitudinal fissure here, if I was to stick my hand into the longitudinal fissure, I would eventually meet something blocking my progress. Okay, and it would be a huge, great connection between the two sides. Okay, so if I stuck my fingers through, I forced them through, I'd be able to part the two cerebral hemispheres apart until I eventually got to something that I could not part. Okay, and this is because this is a connection between the two halves. Okay, this is what we have just cut through. When we've cut through this, we're now going to see this portion here, and this connection is called the corpus callosum. Okay, and it's just a collection of axons moving from one cerebral hemisphere to the other. Okay, and if you cut this in a person, it causes very odd symptoms indeed. It causes what's known as split brain syndrome. Okay, because the two cerebral hemispheres can no longer communicate with one another. Okay, right. Let's put the corpus callosum on this picture then. So, the corpus callosum has an interesting shape. It sort of goes in this sort of shape here. Okay, right, so this is the edge of the corpus callosum that we are seeing. We've cut through it, and we are just seeing the shape that it's in. Okay, so all of this, and we'll colour it in yellow here, which was a bad choice because I've coloured the hypothalamus in that choice, the colour, but never mind. Okay, right. So this is all the corpus callosum. Right, now the cingulate cortex, and there is an anterior cingulate cortex and a posterior cingulate cortex. The cingulate cortex is part of the cerebral cortex, okay, which is around the corpus callosum. So basically, the cerebral cortex is the outer layer of the cerebral hemispheres. Okay, so people are used to understanding that all of this is cerebral cortex, but in fact, when you put your hand into the longitudinal fissure here, okay, you are still feeling the edge of the cerebral hemispheres. There is a boundary to the cerebral hemispheres that lines this longitudinal fissure. Okay, so all of the surface of the cerebral hemisphere that's inside the longitudinal fissure, that's facing into the cavity of the longitudinal fissure, this is all still cerebral cortex. This is where the cingulate cortex is. Okay, it's the portion of cerebral cortex that surrounds the corpus callosum. Okay, like so. Right, so each of the two cerebral hemispheres, the left cerebral hemisphere and the right cerebral hemisphere, both of these will have a cingulate cortex surrounding the corpus callosum. So this one will have a cingulate cortex that sort of is going like this. Okay, and this is the one we're looking at here. Okay, and the other one, the left cerebral hemisphere, will also have a cingulate cortex, and it's in this cavity, so you can't see it from looking at the top. You'd have to be a little man, you'd have to go into the longitudinal fissure and you'd have to look around, and then you'd see that there was a surface of cerebral cortex facing into this cavity for both the left cerebral hemisphere and the right cerebral hemisphere, and this is what we're seeing here. Okay, this is the cingulate cortex, all of this. Okay, right, and it's a piece of cerebral cortex like any other piece of cerebral cortex. Okay, yes, it's not on the surface of the brain, it's hidden, but it is a piece of cerebral cortex. So this is the cingulate cortex. Okay, right, now, let's discuss the first major division of the cingulate cortex. So, there's a line around here that you can't actually find on there. There isn't a real line there, but anatomically we divide it up into two portions. This portion back here is the posterior cingulate cortex, okay, and then the portion at the front is then obviously the anterior cingulate cortex, which is the portion that we are after. Okay, so up here, this is the anterior cingulate cortex, which I told you could be abbreviated as ACC. Okay, so all of this is the anterior cingulate cortex. Now, it's divided into two separate divisions further. Okay, so we divide the anterior cingulate cortex into two separate portions. We divide it into this portion here, which is closer to the posterior cingulate cortex, which is called the caudal anterior cingulate cortex. Now, what does caudal mean? Well, caudal means towards the back of the brain. Literally, caudal means towards the tail. Okay, so this portion is slightly closer to the tail than this portion up here. Okay, or where at least the tail would be if we were monkeys. Okay, that's what caudal means. In the context of the brain, you can interpret caudal, you know, if you're doing embryology, it really does mean towards the tail. But in the context of the brain, caudal is really used to mean posterior. And then there's another word, rostral, which in the context of the brain is really used to mean anterior. Literally, it means towards the nose. Okay, so this other portion of the anterior cingulate cortex here that's closer to the nose is the rostral anterior cingulate cortex. Now, I might add a few extra colours onto this. So this portion that is in pink and orange now, that's the caudal anterior cingulate cortex. And this portion that's going to be in pink and turquoise, this portion is the rostral anterior cingulate cortex there. Okay, right. Now we've done the anatomy, let me describe to you the function of these two portions of the anterior cingulate cortex, because both of them are going to be involved in depression. Okay, so we'll start off with the rostral anterior cingulate cortex. Okay, so in turquoise and purple here. This is incredibly involved in emotion. Good. Okay, this is looking hopeful then. Okay, now, what I want to tell you about now is the other portions of the brain that it connects to. Okay, because it connects to other very, very important portions of the brain that are thought to be involved in emotion. Okay, so let me tell you about the connections of the rostral cortex, because this will give us a few clues as to its function. Okay, so one of the key connections that it has is to the hippocampus. Okay, now let me tell you where the hippocampus is, because we haven't so far discussed the anatomy of the hippocampus. We are going to come back to the hippocampus hugely. We will do its anatomy in much more detail than I'm about to tell you it now. Okay, because we're going to talk about the fact that in depression there is hippocampal atrophy. Okay, the volume of the hippocampus seems to be reduced in depression, and we're going to talk about models for how that occurs. Okay, but for now we don't really need to know the anatomy of the hippocampus that well for our purposes here. Okay, so where is the hippocampus? Well, if I go back to my very simple picture of the brain, in fact I'll go back to it up here. Okay, the hippocampus is within the temporal lobe of the cerebral hemispheres. Okay, so this lobe here that sticks out on the lateral side of the brain, this is known as the temporal lobe. And of course you have one for each cerebral hemisphere. So the left cerebral hemisphere has a temporal lobe, and the right cerebral hemisphere also has a temporal lobe. Okay, now, buried deep within the temporal lobe is the hippocampus, so it's not visible. We can't see it from the side here. You would have to sort of go deep in. You'd have to go. You'd have to take a little chisel and chisel into the temporal lobe, and then what you would find is that the hippocampus is a portion inside here. It's a sausage sort of shape inside the temporal lobe. Okay, so this thing here is the hippocampus. We will do the anatomy of the hippocampus in more detail later. I will show you really what the hippocampus really is it's the edge of the cerebral cortex. Okay, so the temporal lobe folds right around, the cortex folds around, and then right at the free edge, it then sort of folds into this Swiss roll, as it's often compared to, which is the hippocampus here. Okay, but for now, just think of it as buried within the temporal lobe. Okay, right. The hippocampus is, well, the main function that jumps to mind whenever anyone talks about the hippocampus is that it's involved in memory. Okay, especially spatial memory. Okay, so what do I mean by that? I mean, if you leave your car somewhere, and then walk, down many different streets, and you go somewhere you've never been before, okay? You leave your car somewhere, and then you walk down many different streets, many flights of stairs, maybe you're in one of those multi-story car parks. You can remember the way back to the car, okay? Your hippocampus is the reason you can do that, okay? It's in charge of remembering how three-dimensional space is structured, basically, and then remembering where the car is in this three-dimensional model of space that it's got stored, okay? And the famous sort of little example that's given of that is that taxi drivers in massive great cities such as New York tend to have much bigger hippocampuses than normal people, and it's because they need to have this incredible spatial memory of exactly how to get to all of the different places in New York. Okay, right. So that's one of the connections of the rostral anterior cingulate cortex. Okay. Now let's talk about the connections to the amygdala. The amygdala is incredibly involved in emotion as well. Okay, the amygdala particularly is involved in fear and the emotional response to fear. Okay, so where is the amygdala? Well, the amygdala is in a very similar place to the hippocampus. The amygdala is kind of right at the end of the temporal lobe, after the hippocampus has ended, basically. So you find the amygdala right at the end of the temporal lobe, again buried deep within the temporal lobe, so it's not visible, but it's right at the end of the temporal lobe, buried inside. Okay, so here is the amygdala. Okay, and it's incredibly involved in emotion as well. Okay, so the rostral anterior cingulate cortex has connections to the amygdala. Okay, next, the orbital prefrontal cortex. This is extremely involved in emotion. There's the story of how patients who have had the orbital prefrontal cortex destroyed, they lose the ability to love. Okay, so this is a very, very powerful piece of cerebral cortex involved in emotions. Okay, so orbital prefrontal cortex. So let me show you where this is. So the name sort of gives it to you as far as where this is. Orbital, what does that mean? That means pertaining to the orbit. What is the orbit? The orbit is the name for the cavity in which the eyes are present. So if you imagine a skull, okay, they have those cavities where the eyes should be. Those are the orbits. Okay, so orbital means pertaining to the pertaining to the orbit, to the cavity where the eye is. Prefrontal cortex. This is the bit of brain that sits, the bit of cerebral cortex that sits just above the orbital cavity. So it's the bit of your brain that if you, if you were a little man and you could go into the orbit, okay, and then you were to go up, you were to chisel your way up. In fact, I think I'll draw a little picture of this. So if I draw a skull, and this is going to be an embarrassing picture, okay, I'll just draw the top of the skull rather than trying to draw the mandible. Okay, you have the orbits here. Okay, these are the holes where the eyes should be. If you go into the orbit and then chisel up, okay, you will hit a piece of brain. There is a bit of brain sitting above here. Okay, that's the orbital prefrontal cortex. It's this portion of brain here, okay, that faces down and is sitting on top of the orbits. That's the orbital prefrontal cortex. Okay, right. So because it's very near the front of the brain, it's called the prefrontal, and because it's the surface of the cerebral hemispheres, it's called cortex. Okay, so this portion here, that's the orbital prefrontal cortex. Okay, and that bit is incredibly involved in emotion and the consciousness of emotion. Okay, right. Next up, the anterior insula. Again, a very important portion concerning emotion and also pain. This is a negative emotional center. It's not a nice emotional center. If you activate the insular cortex, it triggers terrible conscious perception of pain. Okay, so let me describe where the insular cortex is. Again, this is a really difficult piece to describe where it actually is because it's buried deep within the structure. Okay, so you can't see it just from looking at this picture. Okay, instead what you have to do is you have to go into this crack here. There's a crease between the rest of the cerebral hemisphere and the temporal lobe down here. Okay, and that crease, in fact I'll draw another picture down here. Okay, so what should I do? The picture I'm going to draw next is we're going to imagine now taking a coronal section. Okay, so another fancy word from anatomy. We're going to now take a coronal section instead of taking a sagittal section. So a coronal section means that you take your carving knife, and instead of putting the front of the knife at the front and the back of the knife at the back, okay, instead you put the front of the knife at the left-hand side, let's say, and the back of the knife at the right-hand side. Or, since we're looking at the left-hand side, it would be more natural to put the front of the knife at the right-hand side and the back at the left-hand side. And then you cut down in this sort of a plane here. Okay? We're going to cut through the brain like that, and then we're going to have a look at the opened slices, okay, the opened cross-sections. That's a coronal section, and again, that's a general anatomical piece of terminology. It doesn't just apply to the brain. Okay, right. So, we will look just at this portion where the parietal lobe here, and I should just give you the different portions of the brain. So, you divide the cerebral hemispheres up into these three major portions. Okay, this portion right at the front, this is the frontal lobe. Okay, the middle lobe here, well, the middle portion here, this is known as the parietal lobe. Parietal lobe, and then this portion here we know is the temporal lobe down here, and this portion right at the back, this is the occipital lobe. Okay, so those are the divisions of the cerebral cortex up into four core portions, but you know, the cerebral cortex is divided up into loads of other divisions on the basis of function, some of which we're going to see in a moment. Okay, so I'll just colour this in. Here's the frontal lobe in blue. Okay, so that's the frontal lobe. Okay, here is the parietal lobe in turquoise here. Okay. Here is the occipital lobe right at the back in red here. Okay, and then I won't try and colour on the temporal lobe. Or actually, maybe I will. I'll do it in yellow so it doesn't ruin it. Okay, so here in yellow, this is the temporal lobe, which I've already labelled up here. Okay, right. So we're going to look at the junction between the parietal lobe, the cerebral cortex of the parietal lobe, and the cerebral cortex of the temporal lobe. Okay, right. So, what you'll have is something like this. Here comes the cerebral cortex of the parietal lobe. So I'll colour that in turquoise. Okay, and then you're suddenly going to have the beginnings of this fissure here. Okay, so at the moment we're on the cerebral cortex of the parietal lobe in turquoise here, and we're about to suddenly invaginate inwards. Okay, like so. So the cerebral cortex invaginates inwards here, like so, and then the temporal lobe will be underneath this. Okay, so in yellow here, this is the temporal lobe underneath. Okay, right, so you've got this fissure here, and this fissure is known as the lateral fissure, okay, because it's on the lateral side of the brain. So this is the lateral fissure. Now, what's interesting about the lateral fissure is not only that you've got cerebral cortex lining the lateral fissure, but actually it opens up deep inside. It opens up. Okay, like so. And this opening up, then you have more cerebral cortex lining this little cavity in here. And this portion of cortex here, which I'll colour in vivid purple here, that you can't see. Okay, you'd have to be a little man, you'd have to penetrate your way through the lateral fissure. You'd get into this cavity, and then you'd find a bit of cerebral cortex lining that cavity. Okay, this is the insular cortex. Okay, right, and if you go forward, you know, if you're a little man here and you walk along the insular cortex forward to the front, then you'll get to the anterior insular cortex. Okay, now, the insular cortex as a whole is incredibly important in the emotional response to pain. It's involved in the sadness to pain, okay, along with the anterior cingulate cortex. In fact, the anterior cingulate cortex is involved in the emotional part of pain. The anterior insular is also involved in the conscious, terrible experience of pain, the agony. Okay, indeed, if you stimulate it, people are supposed to feel utter agony, basically. So, that's that. Okay, the next portion that the rostral anterior cingulate cortex connects to is the nucleus accumbens. Okay, and this, again, it's a nightmare to describe where the nucleus accumbens is. We're going to have to do all sorts of neuroanatomy to put this in context. Okay, so I promised you that I would go back and talk about the thalamus in more detail and the midbrain. Okay, I'm going to have to do that now to describe where the nucleus accumbens is, because this is, I have to put it in context of where it is in terms of what we've seen so far, and to do that we need to discuss the thalamus and the midbrain in more detail. Okay, right, so I'm going to have to get some more paper. Oh no, we've got another side. Right, so let's draw out the brainstem again. Okay, so the brainstem then, we know that it consists of the medulla here, okay, like so. Then above the medulla you have the pons, which I'll put here, okay. Then above the pons you have the midbrain. Now what I want to show you is the structure of the midbrain in more detail. Previously I've just shown it like so. Okay, what I now want to do is show you it from above, okay, so that I can then show you the two thalami, the left and the right thalami, sitting on top of the midbrain. Okay, so let me colour in the midbrain then. The midbrain is here in red, and we're now going to look at it from above. Okay, so the midbrain is often compared to looking like Mickey Mouse from above. Okay, and it's because it's got these two sort of processes that stick off from the front, like so. Okay, which look like the ears of Mickey Mouse. Okay, and it really does look like Mickey Mouse. If you see MRI scans which show the midbrain, it really does look like Mickey Mouse. Okay, right, so, but when I draw it, unfortunately, it ends up looking more like a pig rather than Mickey Mouse. Okay, so some key landmarks then of the midbrain. It is one structure, firstly. It may have a left side and a right side, okay, but it is one structure. I should have also told you which side is the front and which side is the back. So this is the anterior portion, this is towards the eyes, and this is the back portion here. Okay, so let's firstly label up some landmarks. So these two sort of bumps on the back, these are what are known as the superior colliculi. Okay, or the singular is the superior colliculus. Colliculus. I think it's like that. Colliculus. That doesn't look right for some reason. I think that is correct though. Then in the middle here, what you have is a region known as the periaqueductal grey matter. Okay, and then running through the periaqueductal grey matter you have the cerebral aqueduct. Okay, so through the midbrain you have a little tube running. Okay, a little tube running like this. Okay, which is known as the cerebral aqueduct. And this tube has got cerebrospinal fluid, CSF, within it. Okay, the portion of grey matter that surrounds the cerebral aqueduct, which I'm colouring in turquoise here, okay, this is known as the periaqueductal grey, and it's very distinguishable when you see it on a cross-section or if you see an MRI scan of it. So this is the periaqueductal grey. Okay, then you have two very distinctive nuclei which make this look more and more like Mickey Mouse because they look like the eyes of Mickey Mouse. Okay, and these nuclei here are the red nuclei. Okay, so I'll colour these in orange rather than red for some reason, but never mind. Okay, they don't actually appear red, they appear black if you see them on the MRI scan. So these are the red nuclei, or the red nucleus, since I've only put an arrow to one of them. Okay, so that's a few landmarks of the midbrain. Okay, right, so now that's sitting on top of the pons, okay, and then what you're going to have on top of the midbrain, you're then going to have two thalami, okay, and I'll try and put this on top of this picture. I'll sort of do it like so. So sitting on top of the midbrain, you'll have, here is the left thalamus on the left side of the midbrain, and here on top of the right side of the midbrain, this is the right thalamus here, okay, like so. So we'll colour these now in green. So when we were looking from the left-hand side, we only saw something like this. We only saw this egg-shaped structure, and we only saw one of these. Okay, but there are two of them. There is a left thalamus and there is a right thalamus, and they're both these sort of egg-shaped structures sitting on top of the midbrain like so. So here is this right thalamus here. Okay, right. Now, the reason this is so important for telling you where the nucleus accumbens is that the nucleus accumbens is in something called the striatum, which is sitting lateral to the thalamus on both sides. You have a left striatum and a right striatum, which are going to be sitting here and here, basically. Okay, so that's why it's important to draw this picture, so that I can now show the striatal structures sitting on either side of the thalami. So, before I can show the nucleus accumbens, I firstly need to show you something called the lenticular nucleus that is sitting on either side of the thalamus. Okay, so we'll just show this for one side, but it's occurring exactly the same on the other side. Okay, so because this nucleus is shaped like a lens, it's called the lenticular nucleus. So this is the lenticular nucleus, and it's made up of two separate portions. Okay, so I'll split it into two portions here. So the more lateral portion here, okay, and I should just say this is at the same level as the thalamus, so if we were looking at this on this picture, it would be in front of the thalamus, sort of like here, and we will look at it from the side in a moment again. Okay, right, so this portion that I'm colouring in orange, which is most lateral, okay, so this is furthest from the midline, this is known as the putamen. Okay, so that's the putamen, and again you'll have a left putamen, which is the one we're seeing here, and you would have a right putamen, which I'd draw if I hadn't put all the labels here. Okay, right. Then, this more internal portion of the lenticular nucleus, and I should stress that both of these make up the lenticular nucleus. Okay, the lenticular nucleus is the entire thing. Okay, this more internal portion, the more medial portion, is known as the globus pallidus. Okay, the globus pallidus. Okay, like so. Right, okay. Now, the putamen is actually the first portion of the striatum. Okay, so, now we've got this picture, what I want to do now is turn away from drawing it like this and go back to drawing it as though we're looking from the left-hand side. So we're going to go back to looking at a picture like this, but this time I'm going to show the putamen in front of the thalamus. Okay, so, once again then, here we have the midbrain. Okay, now, we will have the thalamus, but I'm going to draw the thalamus behind the putamen now. So here is the putamen, and then peeping out from behind, here then is the thalamus. Okay, right. So I'll colour in the putamen. I'm not going to colour in the thalamus at the moment. So at the front then, we are seeing the putamen here in orange. Okay, and then underneath we're seeing the midbrain here in red. Okay, which the thalamus is sitting on top of. Okay, right. Now, attached to the putamen, you're going to have additional structures that are also sitting lateral to the thalami. So they're sitting in a different plane to the thalami. So we will see them in front of the thalamus. Okay, and the first one of these structures that I'm going to show is something known as the caudate nucleus, which will wrap around, okay, like so. Okay, this is all the caudate nucleus. So this is a huge great lump of grey matter that's sitting attached to the putamen here, to the side of the thalamus. Okay, so I'll colour this in now so that it looks as though it's actually in front of the midbrain rather than behind it. Okay, so in vivid purple here, all of this is the caudate nucleus. Okay, and you can see that it sort of wraps around like so. Okay, and this sort of projection down here, this is known as the tail of the caudate nucleus. Okay, so the whole thing in vivid purple here, this is the caudate nucleus. And again, you have one of these on both sides, attached to the putamen in this way. You have a left caudate nucleus and a right caudate nucleus. If I was to try and show this on this picture, it would be kind of like wrapping around like so, and then going down like here. Okay, but it is difficult. Oh, and I've messed it up. No, this bit should be on the other side. I'll just have to finish this now. Finish what you start. Again, repair it, kind of thing like that. Okay, so let me colour it in. That will fix this. Okay, so all of this is the caudate nucleus, sort of sitting on the side like here. Okay, there we go. Right, so this is the left caudate we're clearly looking at here. Okay, and together the caudate and the putamen put together are often called the caudate putamen. Now they are two of the key components of the striatum, but there is one other component of the striatum that I just want to put in, and it's the hole that is left here. Okay, there seems to be a gap here. Okay, there's something going to be sitting there, and I'll colour this in turquoise. And this is the thing we've been after. Okay, this is the nucleus accumbens. Okay, incredibly important. It shows up everywhere, basically. Okay, everywhere with regards to emotion and motivation. Okay, so the nucleus accumbens. Okay, right, and those three structures together, the putamen, the nucleus accumbens, and the caudate nucleus, those are the main bits of the striatum. There are additional little niche bits that you can add on here, but we're not going to bother. Okay, these are the main three portions of the striatum, sometimes called the corpus striatum. If you're being proper, it's called the corpus striatum, but everyone just calls it the striatum. So that's the caudate, the putamen, and the nucleus accumbens, all of those three structures together that are sitting lateral to the thalami. These are the striatum. Okay, so that's the left striatum. Of course, you'll have a right striatum as well. Okay, so that is what the ventral, or rostral rather, the rostral anterior cingulate cortex is connecting to the nucleus accumbens. Okay, right. We'll call it there for this video, and in the next video what we'll do is discuss the caudal anterior cingulate cortex, what it does and what its connections are.